All right, welcome back. Next, we're going to tackle the changes that have to do with typography between Bootstrap 3 and 4. Fortunately, there aren't that many. Really, there's just two things we'll talk about. Page headings, how we make really large text the most important thing on your page, or the most important heading at least. And then also block quotes. And then the third thing we'll talk about isn't a component. It just is behind the scenes, the shift from pixels as a unit to rems, REMs, or RMs. We'll talk about what that means in just a bit. But let's start by going back to this document that highlights the changes. And under typography, there's a couple points. The first one we can skip. It says all the text utilities are now moved to this utilities SAS file. That doesn't matter because this is only for people who are actually digging into the source files. There are many, like 50 plus SAS files that go into making the single Bootstrap file that we include. And this is if you want to edit things or tweak values in those files. That's not what we're doing here. So further down, dropped the page header class, as its styles can now be applied via utilities. So in Bootstrap 3, which I'm looking at now, there was a class called page header you would add to a div and then put some content inside of it. And what it would do is add a border bottom. It would add some, I believe, margin and also padding. Let me double check on that. Yes, so there's padding bottom, margin, and border bottom. Now the reason this was removed is that in Bootstrap 4, we actually have these utilities that we'll talk about in the next video. These utilities that help us add border and padding and margin really, really simply. So instead of adding in an additional class, instead we can just recreate that on our own. So they removed page header. What we did get though are some new utilities. If you go to the Bootstrap 4 docs, go to Content, Typography, and we scroll down. We have just the regular styles for H1s and H6s and all of that. But then we get these larger, fancier display headings. So these are supposed to work with the meat of your page content. So when you need something to stand out. And they're just, according to them, larger, slightly more opinionated heading styles. So they look like this, and all it is some element with a class of display 1, display 2, 3, or 4. So it doesn't have to be an H1, but usually if you are doing something like display 1, it's the largest, most important thing on your page, so it makes sense to be an H1. So I'm going to copy it over. I have a new document here called typography. It is empty. I added some comments to remind me what I want to talk about, but otherwise it just includes the starter from the Bootstrap 4 docs. I added a container in, and actually that container is not closed currently. There we go. So I'm going to paste in these 4 headings, and I'm also going to add in just a regular H1 that doesn't have any classes on it, and just say regular H1 so we can see the difference. And I'm going to refresh the page now. This is a regular H1 in Bootstrap 4. This is display 1, 2, 3, and 4. And of course, we can combine it with things like text info if we want to change the color and use what we talked about in the last video. Okay, so those are the display headings. And we'll come back to the actual sizing because it has to do with rems, RMs, root M's that we'll talk about. But for now, we're going to move on to the next change, which has to do with block quotes. So back on this web page again that details the changes, the next point is redesigned block quotes, moving their styles from the block quote element itself to a single class called block quote. Also, this thing called block quote reverse has been removed. So if we take a look at the old way of doing block quotes, I'll have to go up here, CSS, look at typography, block quotes. What we used to do, we didn't have to add any class names in. It was just block quote and then content. And if we wanted a citation at the bottom, it was block quote with a footer. Now what we do, we actually use classes in addition to the block quote element. So I'm going to go back to Bootstrap 4, typography, block quotes. And you can see we give it block quote class equals block quote. So it's a little chunkier, I guess. But now there isn't extra default styles on our elements. So if we don't want those block quote styles, we just remove the class. But if we do want them, we can add it in. Versus in the past, if you didn't want them, it was a little more annoying. You had to overwrite everything. Now you might notice this MB0. This we'll talk about in the next video. It is not necessary. It just sets the margin bottom of this paragraph to be 0. So it has to do with margin. But we'll still get the nice styles without it. But I'm going to copy this over, this block quote, under my little comment that says block quotes. And I'm also going to duplicate this, but remove the block quote class. So we now have two. This one has no block quote class and this one does. I'm going to save, refresh the page, and you can see there's not a huge difference, but this one, the font size is a little larger, and I believe there's a little margin added as well. Now, what we can also do is add a citation, of course, and now we need to use the class block quote dash footer. We didn't have to do that in the past. So it's class equals block quote footer, and then we add the cite element around whatever we're citing, and that will italicize it, and it also just makes it clearer that this is a citation. It adds some meaning to our markup. And in addition, you can see we get this dash for free. I'm just going to copy this over and add it at the bottom again. And this time I'm going to say this was, I don't know, spoken. Let's say written by my cat. And then in here, I'm going to put my cat's name, Blue Steel. And also, it's best to change this title to match, because that's the point of this cite element. And we're going to save. And if I refresh, we now have this written by my cat, Blue Steel citation. And just to show you, if I remove this MB0 class and refresh, we just have extra space there, so it doesn't break anything. But a lot of people like the citation to be right up against the block quote. Anyway, so it's a slight change, but you do have to add in these classes that you didn't do in the past, or you didn't need to do. In addition, there used to be this thing called block quote reverse, where everything would be right aligned and the dash would be right aligned. That no longer exists. Instead, if you want a block quote to be right aligned, you come here and you just say, I'm going to duplicate this, block quote, text dash right. And now we have a right aligned block quote. However, we don't actually get the dash on the right side, so it is a little bit different. I just zoomed out if you're wondering what that was. But it is right aligned, and they removed that reversed class. Okay, so that's all there is for block quotes. Honestly, I don't use them very much, so I feel bad taking up this much time to discuss them, but I do want to highlight the changes. Now, the big change that is important has to do with the font units that we actually work with in Bootstrap. So back here somewhere, it mentioned the change from pixels to rems. Somewhere, where is that? Here we go. Switch from pixels to rems as our primary CSS unit. So this is important, and it goes along with this. Global font size increased from 14 to 16 pixels. So in the past, most things in Bootstrap were hard-coded values with pixels, px units. So if I said, for example, this display one, it didn't exist, but let's say if it did in Bootstrap 3, maybe it's 72 pixels, and it's always 72 pixels. Now with rems stand for root ems, which I know it's very confusing. M is EM, you pronounce it as M. And initially it had to do with the actual width of the letter M, but that's kind of irrelevant at this point. You can read about it online. There's a long storied history, but it is a relative unit that basically takes the font size of the root. So the root is the top level HTML element. And in Bootstrap, that is set to 16 pixels, and that's usually the browser default these days. So if we said one root M, that's going to just multiply the root font size, which is 16, by 1. So it's just 16 pixels. If I said two rems, it would be 32 pixels. I can't do math. And so on. So it's a multiplier, and you can do 1.2, 1.5, whatever you want. Why this matters is that if that root font size changes, all of this will shift as well. So I'm going to make this full screen and inspect. First, just to show you that when we give it the class of display1, it is set to 6 rems. Without it, we just have a regular h1. Add it back in, it's a lot larger. So 6 rems is actually 6 times the default root value for font size, which is 16. So whatever 6 times 16 is. But what's cool is that as I change, if I actually go to the root and I give it a new font size, so I'm just going to say font size is now, let's say 12 pixels. Everything just shifted down. Or what about 4 pixels? Everything shrunk because now everything is in touch. It's all relative and it scales together. So if I went larger, like 30, everything gets a lot larger, or 50, things get massive, but it's all still relative to one another. So this is still 6 times the regular font size of the body, or of the root. Whereas if I was using pixels and I set this to be 72 pixels, it's always going to be 72 pixels. No matter what I'm changing the root element to be, it doesn't have an impact. But now everything is linked together, so it makes it very easy. I can just say, I want this thing to be 2 times the regular root font size. I want this to be 5, 10. But often we actually work with smaller units like 1.5, 1.7, 2, 2.5. 6 is kind of extreme, and it makes something very large. Anyway, that's it for typography. So the key changes were these new classes, display 1 through 4, to make things extra large, and also it lightens their font weight. We also saw block quotes changed. You now have to use some additional classes, and we also talked about rems, root, ems, and what that change means to have a relative unit instead of pixels, which are hard-coded. All right.